Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the heavy wooden doors of a medieval castle and slipping inside on one of the frostiest nights you can imagine. The kind where your breath hangs in the air like smoke, and the stone walls around you feel less like shelter and more like a giant refrigerator. This is no cosy Airbnb with central heating. You probably won't survive this night if you were actually dropped here, but that's why we're telling the story instead of reenacting it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your city and the current time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is listening from. It makes this little late night time machine feel less lonely. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the corridor of the keep, boots echoing on stone. Instantly the cold wraps around you. Not a modern winter chill, the kind you fix with a fleece blanket, but a deeper cold that seeps into your skin. Castles are designed for defence, not comfort. Their thick walls, while perfect for keeping out arrows and siege engines, are also perfect for locking in the icy damp of winter. If you imagine curling up against a stone wall thinking it might be like resting against a cool basement in summer, you're in for disappointment. These stones hold on to the winter cold and breathe it into your chamber like a stubborn ghost. This first scene is a reality check. Knights didn't glide into feather-stuffed luxury. Sure, the nobility could afford tapestries, heavy furs, maybe even down bedding imported from far-off lands, but underneath it all the same drafty architecture mocked them. Tiny arrow slits acted like nature's air conditioners, permanently open vents that whistled cold wind directly into the chambers. You might try covering the openings with cloth or wood, but air found its way in anyway, and you can forget glass windows, not yet. You've got wooden shutters at best, rattling all night as if the wind is trying to play percussion in the hallway. A quirky little fact. Some chroniclers mention that people actually liked the bracing cold, believing it made the body tougher. There are tales of men who claim they slept better after the castle had been aired out. Whether or not this was bravado is up for debate, because let's be honest, nobody prefers frostbite to comfort. But you'll find echoes of this idea centuries later, when parents told their children to sleep with the window open for good health, even in winter. Cold has always been dressed up as character building. Historians, though, still argue about just how frigid these interiors got. Some say tapestries and fireplaces gave noble bedrooms a certain coziness, while others insist you could see your breath indoors throughout the season. The truth is probably somewhere in between, depending on wealth, castle design, and whether servants had kept the fire alive all night. But if you've ever stood in an unheated stone church on a January morning, you already have a hint of what nights faced. Imagine yourself now inside one of those private chambers. A single torch flickers on the wall, casting shadows across carved wooden furniture. The rush mats on the floor crunch underfoot, releasing a faint scent of herbs, lavender or sweet flag, meant to mask the less glamorous odours of medieval life. Your cloak clings to you, stiff with frost, and the sound of the winter wind claws at the shutters. This is the world a knight had to prepare for before crawling into bed. And about that bed, it's not the king-size luxury mattress your brain might imagine. It's raised, yes, and often large enough to hold more than one sleeper. Its frame is sturdy oak, creaking faintly when you lean on it. Ropes crisscross underneath to support a straw mattress, which sags if the ropes aren't regularly tightened. The straw itself is replaced when it becomes infested with bugs, but let's just say the timeline for that wasn't daily, or even monthly. Over this base might lie a feather-stuffed bag if you're lucky, topped with blankets of wool or fur. You pile everything on because the enemy here is not an army outside the walls, it's the icy air waiting to steal your warmth as soon as you stop moving. Take a moment to picture the sensory layers. You press a hand against the wall, stone so cold it makes your skin tingle. You draw your cloak tighter, your breath fogging in the dim light. The smell of smoke from the fireplace lingers in the chamber, mingled with the earthy scent of damp straw. Outside the room, faint echoes carry down the hall, the bark of a dog, the shuffle of a guard changing post. Inside, the only real comfort is knowing you have at least a chance at a bed, while many peasants outside the castle will spend the night on simple pallets or bare floors, warmed only by livestock nearby. There's a small comfort in ritual. Before lying down, a knight might cross himself, whisper a prayer to St. George or St. Michael, hoping for protection through the night. Not just protection from the cold, but from things believed to prowl the darkness: spirits, demons, restless souls. If you're already half shivering, half convinced that some ghost could slip in through the drafty shutters, the prayer doesn't just soothe your spirit, it's a mental blanket. So tonight, as you pull those imagined furs over yourself, you feel the paradox of a medieval castle bedroom, both luxurious and hostile, both protective fortress and icebox. This is only the beginning, the first layer of how a knight survived those brutal nights. From here, we'll dig into the bedding itself, the little tricks that meant the difference between shivering awake and drifting into uneasy, frost-nipped dreams. You've settled into that first impression of the castle's icy breath, and now it's time to peel back the layers, literally. Because a night's survival on the coldest nights didn't depend on one miracle invention, but on a kind of bedding sandwich. Think of it like medieval lasagna: straw, feathers, wool, and fur stacked up until you had something between you and hypothermia. At the base was the straw mattress, called a pallet. Imagine a long sack stuffed with dried straw, changed out maybe twice a year if you were lucky. Over time it compacted, grew lumpy, and inevitably collected a few unwelcome guests like lice or fleas. People sometimes added dried herbs into the mix: lavender, sage, even wormwood, to repel bugs and sweeten the smell. If you've ever camped on a thin sleeping pad over rough ground, you know the feeling. It cushioned you from the wooden frame beneath, but not by much. And when the straw grew flat, you felt every knot in the rope lattice that supported the bed. Sleep tight, as the phrase supposedly comes from, was about those ropes needing to be tightened, otherwise you sagged right through the frame. But if you were higher up the social ladder, say, a knight, rather than a common squire, you might get another layer, the feather bed. Picture a giant fabric sack stuffed with goose or duck down. Feather beds were considered a true luxury, imported in some cases or gifted to newlyweds as part of a dowry. They were expensive, high maintenance, and utterly delightful compared to straw. Lay down on one, and you'd sink in as if you'd been claimed by a fluffy cloud. The downside, you sank so deep it was hard to roll out. Medieval complaints survive about people feeling smothered in them, not exactly what you want if you're already wearing layers of itchy wool. Now cover this with sheets of linen, bleached if your household was wealthy, rough and scratchy if not. Linen was the go-to fabric for anything close to the skin because it was easier to wash than wool. But washing wasn't as frequent as modern ears would like. Once a month, maybe. Maybe. Still, linen sheets were considered a mark of civility and comfort. Wrap them around yourself and you'd at least feel a thin, clean layer between your skin and whatever mystery critters might lurk in the bedding below. Over the sheets came blankets. Wool was the standard. Thick, coarse, sometimes dyed, often just natural brown or grey. If the winter was harsh enough, you'd pile 2, 3, or even 4 blankets on top of each other until you felt like a knight being slowly pressed into a sandwich. For the wealthier, furs entered the picture: bear, wolf, fox, even imported sable if you wanted to flaunt your status. Fur wasn't just fashion, it was survival. Lay a bearskin across your bed and suddenly you had a heating system that didn't involve relighting a smoky fire at midnight. The fur would hold heat better than plain cloth, and the sheer weight of it kept restless sleepers pinned in place. There's a charming, if slightly odd, fact. Medieval bedspreads were often embroidered with family crests or religious symbols, so even when you curled into your furs, you were literally blanketed by reminders of your loyalty and piety. It's as if the decor followed you into your dreams, nudging you to stay dutiful even under the covers. Some households even rotated bedding depending on the season, stashing lighter linens for summer and dragging out the monster furs when snow arrived. But here's where debate creeps in. Historians don't all agree on how universally accessible feather beds and heavy furs really were. Some argue that knights on campaign, or even poorer household knights, relied on straw mattresses and maybe one woolen blanket, leaving luxury to the lords. Others suggest the knightly class, being a step above peasants, always had some form of feather or fur, even if modest. The reality was probably uneven. In a grand fortress, yes, knights had layers. In a small garrison outpost, they might have been lucky just to find enough dry straw for a pallet. Now close your eyes for a moment and picture lying under those layers. The straw below crunches faintly every time you shift. Above you, wool blankets press down, heavy enough that your arms move slower under them. The fur on top smells faintly of smoke from the fire, and maybe of the animal it once was. Around you, the cold stone walls still radiate their chill, but your little bedding fortress traps a bubble of heat. It's not central heating. It's not your weighted blanket at home, but it's enough. And when you tuck the edges tight to your chin, you almost forget the whistling draft clawing at the shutters. Of course, warmth was never perfectly sealed in. You'd still feel the occasional icy tendril sneaking under the covers, like a mischievous ghost pulling at your toes. To cope, people learned to sleep curled in tight positions, knees drawn up, arms folded in, making their bodies as small and heat-efficient as possible. Sprawling luxuriously wasn't an option unless you wanted to wake up shivering. Bed sharing, which we'll get to later, made all of this easier, but for now, bedding alone was your armour against the long night. So, when a knight retired to bed after a day of training, feasting or patrolling, what he carried with him was this ritual of layering: straw, feathers, linen, wool, fur. Each step turned a hostile stone chamber into something survivable, and tomorrow we'll see how the body itself, plus maybe another body beside it, added the final and most surprising insulation system. Now that you're cocooned under those layers of straw, feathers and fur, let's peel back one more detail. What exactly were you wearing to bed? Because if you think knights just stripped down to their underwear and slipped between the sheets, that's the wrong era. Sleeping attire in the Middle Ages was all about practicality, scratchiness, and a little bit of superstition. The foundation of it all was linen. Linen chemises, nightshirts, or simple tunics were the go-to sleepwear for men and women alike. They were long, reaching almost to the ankles with loose sleeves that let you move freely. Linen had the advantage of being breathable, and, compared to wool, much easier to launder. But don't imagine silky pyjamas or modern cotton comfort. These nightshirts could be rough, itchy and stiff, depending on how finely they'd been woven and how often they'd been washed. Still, in a world without showers or laundry machines, simply changing into a cleanish linen shirt at night was a form of hygiene and a small luxury. Over this, knights might wear additional layers depending on the season. In summer, linen alone might suffice. But on those freezing winter nights, they often slept in woolen hose. Think long, scratchy stockings tied at the waist, or even wrapped themselves in cloaks. Imagine going to bed with half your daytime clothes still clinging to you, because you couldn't afford to lose any heat. This wasn't just laziness, it was survival. Even mittens and caps were sometimes worn in bed, because the body loses so much heat through the extremities. Yes, a medieval knight would go to sleep looking like someone halfway between a shepherd and a bundled-up toddler. Here's where things get quirky. There are reports of people using bed caps, small cloth hats designed to keep heat from escaping through the head. They weren't just a Christmas Carol cliché. Nightcaps were real, and they served the very practical purpose of stopping drafts from sneaking into your ears while you slept. Imagine lying down with your wool socks pulled up, a linen tunic tugged tight, and a little bonnet tied snugly around your head. Not the most heroic knightly image, but absolutely authentic. Of course, not everyone agreed on how much clothing one should wear to bed. Some people believed too many layers were unhealthy, trapping bad vapours close to the body. Others swore that wearing extra clothes to bed was the only way to avoid waking up half frozen. And scholars today still debate the issue. Did most people sleep nearly clothed, or did they strip down more often than we assume? Some evidence from household inventories suggests spare nightshirts were common, which supports the idea of separate sleeping garments. But in campaign situations, or when a knight was far from home, they may have just collapsed in whatever clothes they had on. You can picture the trade-off. Sleeping in wool kept you warmer, but it itched like crazy. Sleeping in linen felt softer, but it wasn't as insulating. So, knights often layered one over the other, linen closest to the skin, wool over it, and fur blankets on top. If you've ever doubled up on pyjamas and socks during a power outage, you've had a taste of what this felt like. Another curious little note, some noble households had special fur-lined night robes for winter. Imagine putting on what looks like a giant velvet bathrobe, trimmed with rabbit fur or lined with sheepskin. These were so heavy you could barely roll over once you were inside, but they gave the wearer an aura of wealth, even in the privacy of their chamber. A knight fortunate enough to marry into money might end up wearing one of these, basking in warmth while his squire shivered in the servants' quarters. Now pause for a moment and picture yourself in that outfit. You've slipped off your armour, unbuckled all those straps, and finally pulled a linen chemise over your head. It feels a little stiff against your skin, but at least it's cleaner than the tunic you wore all day. You slide woolen hose onto your legs and tie them up, then pull a cloak around your shoulders as if you're about to go for a midnight walk. Finally, you tug on a soft wool cap. You're no longer the knight in shining armour, you're the knight in itchy pyjamas. But the transformation is crucial, because now, when you slide under those blankets, you're trapping one more precious layer of heat. And what about superstition? Well, sleepwear sometimes carried charms, embroidered crosses on the hem of a shirt, or tiny relics stitched into fabric, acted as spiritual shields against bad dreams and demons. Night wasn't just about cold, it was about the unseen. A knight might wear a cross necklace to bed, or keep a tiny amulet under his pillow, because warmth and protection weren't just physical, they were spiritual too. So as the fire sputters low in the chamber and the last torchlight flickers, you lie there layered like a cabbage, linen against your skin, wool scratching at your legs, a cloak tugged tight, and a little cap bobbing on your head. Hardly glamorous. But in that outfit, on that bedding, you've got a fighting chance of making it to morning without feeling like your toes are blocks of ice. Next time, though, we'll uncover an even more intimate survival trick: body heat, and why one night's bed was rarely a solo affair. You're bundled in scratchy wool, wrapped under layers of fur and lying stiff as a log on straw. But let's be honest, the real secret weapon against the cold wasn't fabric, it was flesh, shared heat. Bed sharing was so common in medieval life that sleeping alone was almost considered wasteful, if not downright suspicious. A knight's chamber wasn't necessarily his solitary sanctuary. On the coldest nights, warmth often came from the body beside you. Now, before your imagination sprints too far ahead, let's set the scene properly. In a great hall, dozens of people might sleep side by side, lined up on rushes with their cloaks pulled tight, creating a patchwork of bodies pressed together for warmth. In more private chambers, a knight might share a bed with his squire, a fellow knight, or, when circumstances allowed, his spouse. The logic was simple. Two bodies generate more heat than one, and when you're living in a stone icebox that no fireplace can truly warm, snuggling becomes less about romance and more about survival. Think about how even today campers huddle in sleeping bags together when temperatures plummet. The physics hasn't changed. The human body is a furnace giving off heat constantly. Alone, your warmth disperses into the cold air. Together, warmth pools, creating a microclimate under the blankets. Medieval people weren't ignorant of this fact. They leaned into it, with fewer taboos about bed sharing than modern individualist culture would expect. In fact, sharing beds wasn't only for warmth, it was a social norm. Travelling merchants, monks, squires, and yes, knights often paired up when lodging at an inn or garrison. It was cheaper, and in many cases, expected. Records describe nobles hosting guests and tucking them into bed right beside them, no raised eyebrows included. Today, we might reserve such closeness for family or partners. In the Middle Ages, it was just what you did. Here's a quirky fact that always makes people grin. Some accounts describe kings and high-ranking lords sleeping in the same bed as their favoured knights or counsellors, not out of intimacy, but out of trust. Sharing a bed symbolised closeness in loyalty and friendship. Imagine being a knight, summoned to the Lord's chamber, and instead of a private audience you're told to climb under the covers. It sounds bizarre to us, but back then it was a sign you were part of the inner circle. But scholars argue about the nuances. Some say knights and squires regularly shared beds out of necessity, while others suggest nobility kept more distance, using multiple beds or chambers when wealth allowed. Inventories list spare bedsteads in some castles, hinting that not everyone had to bunk up. Still, the evidence of communal sleeping in halls, inns, and during campaigns is overwhelming. Chances are, if you were a knight in the 13th century, you weren't drifting off alone. Now imagine yourself lying there, shoulder pressed to another body, your combined warmth seeping into the mattress. At first it feels awkward. You shift, trying not to elbow the poor soul beside you, but the cold presses down harder than your pride. Soon you're grateful for the extra heat, even if it comes with the sound of snoring or the faint smell of ale on their breath. You learn to synchronize your movements, rolling over together like logs in a fire. You might even joke about it in the daylight, but in the dark of the chamber it feels less like a joke and more like survival. Sometimes the bed held more than two. Families often piled in together, parents, children, sometimes even servants, forming a literal heap of humanity. In the great hall, imagine rows of knights stretched out, cloaks doubling as blankets, pressed shoulder to shoulder like sardines. The snores, the coughs, the occasional shifting. It wasn't exactly peaceful. Yet the collective body heat kept the room tolerable, even when frost decorated the inside of the shutters. And let's not forget the animals. Yes, in lower households, dogs and even livestock sometimes slept indoors, their heat mingling with the humans. In castles, dogs often curled at the foot of beds. A greyhound, a mastiff, or even a smaller lapdog could add just enough warmth to be worth the inconvenience of fur in the sheets. It might sound a bit rustic, but anyone who's ever had a pet knows the comfort of a warm animal pressed against your legs at night. Picture it now. You're lying under the weight of wool blankets, your linen shirt sticking to your skin, and the knight next to you shifts closer, muttering in his sleep. You sigh, tuck your freezing hands under the blanket and feel the shared warmth spread across the small space. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, and the torchlight dies down into glowing embers. But inside the cocoon of bodies, there's a bubble of heat, fragile but real. This communal sleeping arrangement reminds us that medieval life wasn't built around the idea of personal space. Privacy was rare, warmth was precious, and both were often sacrificed for practicality. Whether beside your squire, your fellow knight, or even your hound, bed-sharing meant survival. And maybe, just maybe, a better chance of waking up without frostbitten toes. So you're bundled in scratchy layers, tucked under heavy furs, and maybe even pressed up against another human furnace for survival. But still, let's not forget one of the most obvious ways people tried to cheat the cold: fire. Chimneys, fireplaces, and portable braziers were the medieval equivalent of central heating, only a lot smokier, riskier, and more unpredictable. A knight's chamber wasn't just warmed by blankets and body heat. It sometimes depended on whether a fire could be coaxed to stay alive through the long hours of the night. Picture the fireplace first. Early medieval castles didn't even have them. Fires were built in open hearths in the centre of great halls, with smoke drifting upward toward a hole in the roof. Cosy in theory, suffocating in practice. It wasn't until the 12th century that more sophisticated chimneys appeared, channeling smoke up and out instead of letting it billow into everyone's lungs. But even then, fireplaces were far from perfect. Drafts often sucked the warmth right up the flue, leaving you with more smoke than heat. And when the fire sputtered out in the middle of the night, you were left with a chamber colder than before. That's where braziers came in. Imagine a metal or clay container, filled with glowing coals, placed strategically near a bed to radiate heat. Sounds brilliant. Until you remember that castles weren't equipped with carbon monoxide detectors. A brazier left too close to bedding could smother sleepers with invisible fumes, or worse, send sparks onto the straw and set the whole place ablaze. It was warmth versus safety, and often warmth won. Servants were sometimes tasked with checking braziers through the night, but let's be honest, plenty of people took their chances. Now, if you're imagining a knight's private chamber with a roaring blaze and dancing shadows on the wall, you're not entirely wrong. Wealthier knights and lords did enjoy fireplaces, and they sometimes hung heavy tapestries around the hearth to trap warmth inside a sort of fabric bubble. The fire would glow, casting golden light on carved wooden furniture and iron fittings. You could almost convince yourself you were comfortable, until the fire sank low and the draft from the arrow slits reminded you where you really were. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval people believed that smoke itself had protective qualities. Some thought it kept away evil spirits. Others claimed the acrid air killed disease. Whether or not that was true, the constant haze of smoke inside castles probably did more harm than good. Imagine trying to fall asleep with itchy eyes, a scratchy throat, and the faint paranoia that the logs might collapse and spit embers into your bedding. Romantic, right? Historians debate how effective these fireplaces really were. Some argue that a well-built hearth could heat a chamber significantly, especially when combined with tapestries, carpets, and a canopy bed to trap warmth. Others point out that stone walls bled heat so quickly that even the largest blaze barely took the edge off. Archaeological studies of castles with surviving chimneys suggest both truths were possible. In smaller enclosed rooms you might get cosy by the fire. In cavernous halls the heat vanished before it reached anyone beyond arm's length. Now imagine yourself as the knight in this picture. You've stripped off your armour and padded over to the fireplace, your boots crunching over rushes scattered on the floor. The fire glows, its light painting the walls in flickering orange. You stretch your hands out, feeling the sting of returning warmth in your fingers. For a moment you're convinced this fire will last all night. You crawl into bed, wrapping yourself in furs, listening to the steady crackle. But hours later, when you wake shivering, the flames have died into a faint glow, and your breath once again fogs in the air. You curse softly, tug the blankets tighter, and wonder if you should call for a servant to poke the embers back to life. And that's where the servants came in. Pages or squires often had the inglorious task of keeping the night's fire alive. They'd creep in at odd hours, stirring coals, adding logs, and quietly retreating before the night stirred. If they forgot, or simply fell asleep themselves, the night woke up colder than he'd gone to bed. It was a job no one envied, but in a drafty castle it was critical. Of course, fire wasn't the only trick. Beds themselves sometimes had built-in solutions. The four-poster canopy bed wasn't just about showing off wealth. It was a practical heat trap. Draw curtains around the bed, and suddenly you had your own miniature chamber inside the larger, colder one. Inside, the combined heat of bodies, blankets, and maybe a small brazier created a pocket of tolerable warmth. Even as frost formed on the walls outside, picture it again. You're curled beneath furs, curtains drawn around your bed, the faint glow of the fire filtering through. Outside the canopy, the air is bitter, sharp enough to sting your nose, but inside, it's almost snug, like being wrapped in a tent. You can still hear the fire crackle, still smell the tang of wood smoke in your hair, but for now, you've created a fortress within a fortress. That's the thing about fire in a medieval castle. It was both a friend and a danger. A comfort, yes, but one that could vanish in hours, leaving you to wake in icy darkness. Or worse, it could leap from logs to straw, turning survival into catastrophe. A knight had to balance risk with rest, and in the heart of winter, risk often seemed worth it. The private chamber with its fireplace and canopy bed may sound cosy enough, but let's face it, not every knight was lucky enough to enjoy that level of comfort. In fact, a surprising number of cold nights were spent not in solitude but communally, right there in the heart of the castle, the Great Hall. If you picture it, the Great Hall was essentially the living room, dining room, courtroom, and dormitory of medieval life all rolled into one. And when the temperature plummeted, the Great Hall became a giant sleepover for anyone without a chamber of their own. The setup went something like this. After the evening meal, when the tables had been cleared and the floor swept of crumbs and spilled ale, servants spread fresh rushes, or sometimes just straw, across the floor. Onto this went cloaks, blankets, and whatever bedding a person had managed to drag along. Knights who weren't of the highest rank might bunk here with squires, guests, or even household staff. Imagine rows of bodies lined up under wool blankets, pressed shoulder to shoulder in front of the central hearth, like an army bedding down in a barracks. Now, at first glance, you might think, great, everyone's near the fire. That sounds warm, but remember how medieval fires worked. Huge open hearths in cavernous rooms, their heat rising quickly into the rafters. If you were right up close, you roasted one side of your body while the other froze. A few feet further back, the fire might as well not exist. You could be lying there staring at the glow, but your toes would still be stiff with cold. And all that smoke? It didn't go out a neat chimney. It lingered, curling up toward the high beams, seeping into your hair, your blankets, your lungs. Falling asleep in the Great Hall meant waking up smelling like a smoked ham. Here's a fun, slightly odd fact. People sometimes scattered fragrant herbs like lavender, thyme, or rushes mixed with mint across the hall floor before everyone lay down. It wasn't just to freshen the air. It was also believed to discourage fleas, lice, and even evil spirits. So while you lay there on the rushes, wrapped in your cloak, you might catch the faint scent of thyme battling valiantly against the stronger odours of sweat, smoke, and unwashed wool. A medieval version of Febreze, if you will. Of course, not everyone thought the Great Hall was a good sleeping arrangement. Some scholars argue that knights, being of higher status, usually had small chambers of their own, or shared quarters with fewer people. Others point to records and illustrations showing warriors lined up like sardines on campaign or in a lord's hall. The truth likely varied depending on wealth, rank, and circumstance. But there's little doubt that communal sleeping was common, privacy was rare, warmth was the priority. Imagine yourself now in that great hall. You've rolled out your bedding, a rough blanket, maybe a thin feather mattress if you've carried one. Around you, other knights are settling in. The the clatter of swords and shields being set aside echoing off the stone. You hear murmurs of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter, the bark of a hound nosing its way between sleepers in search of scraps. The fire flickers in the centre, throwing shadows up onto the high timbered ceiling. Slowly the chatter fades, replaced by snores and the occasional cough. You curl in tighter, trying to ignore the draught sneaking under the heavy oak doors. The great hall had its advantages, though. There was safety in numbers, band together with your fellow knights, and the warmth wasn't just physical, it was psychological. You weren't alone in the freezing dark. You were part of a brotherhood, enduring the cold together, and if danger struck in the night, you were already gathered in one place, your weapons close at hand. There's a reason the word companionship comes from sharing bread and by extension sharing space. In the medieval hall, companionship extended to sharing the cold night too. Still, it wasn't exactly restful. Imagine trying to drift off while the knight 2 feet away snores like a sawmill, another mutters in his sleep, and someone in the corner is retching up too much ale from the feast. You'd roll over, tug the blanket tighter, and remind yourself that at least you weren't outside with the peasants, whose huts offered even less insulation than the stone walls around you. This was luxury in its way, and yet even in this communal arrangement there were little gradations of comfort. The closer you were to the hearth, the better. Higher-ranking knights or honoured guests often claimed those coveted spots. Further out, you might be stuck with a drafty corner or a patch of rushes still damp from last week's rain. Your bedmate could be a loyal squire, or the castle hound, who insisted on curling right against your legs whether you wanted him there or not. So the Great Hall became a paradox, part dormitory, part barracks, part sauna, part refrigerator. Warm in patches, smoky in others, drafty everywhere. But in the context of medieval life, it was normal, even comforting. For a night, sleeping shoulder to shoulder with comrades wasn't just about keeping warm. It was about reinforcing the bonds of loyalty, endurance, and shared hardship that defined the knightly world. Now let's shift the focus from the knight himself to the invisible workforce that made his knight survivable. The servants, squires, and pages who work behind the scenes to keep the chamber warm and the bedding in place. Because no matter how brave or skilled a knight was in battle, when it came to winter nights in a castle, he was utterly dependent on the small army of attendants whose job was, frankly, to keep him from freezing his armoured behind off. Start with the fire. As we touched on earlier, that fireplace wasn't self-sustaining. Once the knight retreated to bed, it was usually a page's job to creep in periodically and stoke the flames. Imagine being that poor boy, no more than 12 or 13 years old, tiptoeing across the rush-covered floor with an armload of logs, trying not to wake his master. He'd crouch by the hearth, poke the embers, maybe add kindling, then slip away again like a shadow. If he forgot, or if the wind sucked the fire down to ashes, the knight would wake in a chamber as frigid as the courtyard. And rest assured, the page would hear about it in the morning. Then there was the bedding. Beds had to be shaken out, sheets tucked, furs laid properly, and the ropes beneath tightened. Sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, depending on how particular the household was. Squires might be tasked with turning the straw mattress so that it didn't become a nest of lice. Some households even scented the sheets with herbs, stuffing lavender or dried rosemary between the layers, not for luxury, but for pest control. Imagine climbing into bed and breathing in the faint fragrance of rosemary, while outside the wind howled like wolves. That little herbal note might be the only thing that made the room feel halfway civilized. But warming the night wasn't just about fires and blankets. Sometimes servants acted as living hot water bottles. In wealthier households, they heated stones in the hearth, wrapped them in cloth, and tucked them under the bedding before the night retired. But in other cases, squires literally warmed the bed with their own bodies. They'd lie in it for an hour before the night came in, heating up the straw and linens with their body heat, then slip out quietly when their master was ready. Can you picture it? You're a knight. You stride into your chamber after a long day, and your squire has just vacated your bed. Warm, toasty, already waiting for you. No electric blanket could compare. Here's a quirky little fact. In some records we find evidence of warming pans. Metal pans filled with glowing coals that were slid between the sheets. It sounds ingenious, but also incredibly dangerous. Spark, smoke and sheets don't mix well. The servants using them had to keep the pan moving constantly, otherwise the bedding could scorch or catch fire. Talk about job hazards. Imagine explaining to your lord that his feather mattress just went up in flames because you lingered a moment too long. Historians debate how much comfort these servants actually managed to create. Some argue that with diligent fire tending, heavy curtains, and warming tricks, a knight's chamber could be reasonably snug even in deep winter. Others counter that the sheer volume of stonework and the endless draughts made true warmth nearly impossible, no matter how many squires scurried around with hot stones and coal pans. The truth probably lies in the middle. It was survivable, not comfortable, and the difference between the two often depended on whether the servants had done their jobs right. Now let's step into the scene. Imagine yourself as the knight. You've just come in from the great hall, your body aching from the weight of armour worn all day. Your page has already laid out your bedding, furs stacked neatly, linen pulled taut, a faint smell of mint lingering in the rushes. The fire is burning low but not dead. You touch the bed and feel it's warm, recently occupied by someone who dutifully gave up his own heat for yours. You sigh, climb in and sink down, grateful for that small detail. Outside the shutters, the wind claws at the walls. Inside, for now, you feel insulated from the worst of it. Of course, the servants themselves weren't so lucky. They slept in less luxurious quarters, sometimes directly on the floor outside the knight's chamber, or in unheated garrets with only straw and thin blankets. The irony was stark. They gave their warmth and labour to keep their master comfortable, while shivering through the night themselves. Yet in the rigid hierarchy of medieval life, this was simply how it was. The knight's comfort symbolised the household's order, and every page or squire played his part in maintaining that fragile illusion of coziness within a frozen fortress. So while you drift off under your furs, know this: your rest depends entirely on the quiet, unseen hands of those servants, creeping about in the dark, hauling logs, shaking out straw, and even warming your bed with their own bodies. Without them, the nightly chamber would be just another stone box filled with cold air and shadows. With them, it became, if not exactly warm, at least survivable. Now, we've talked about canopy beds, furs, and even warm sheets, but what happened when knights didn't get any of that? When the luxury of a chamber wasn't available and the choice was simple: the cold stone floor or nothing at all? This wasn't just the fate of squires or servants. Even knights on campaign or during moments of overcrowding in a castle sometimes had to surrender to the ground. And let me tell you, sleeping on stone is less like taking rest and more like slowly freezing while your bones file complaints. Imagine it. You come in late from a patrol, armour stiff with frost, and every chamber is full. The lord's family takes the rooms with fireplaces, the honoured guests fill the beds, even the squires have claimed the warmer spots in the hall. What's left? A corner of the passageway, the cold floor pressing its unwelcoming surface into your spine. You spread your cloak as thin padding, wrap yourself in whatever blanket you've got, and hope that sheer exhaustion will knock you out before the cold works its way into your marrow. Stone wasn't just hard, it was an active participant in your misery. Thick castle walls absorbed the outside chill all day and released it at night like an inverted oven. Lying against the floor meant lying against a slab of ice masquerading as architecture. Your breath fogs, your joints ache, and even with your cloak wrapped tight, the heat leaks away faster than you can generate it. If you've ever camped on frozen ground without a sleeping pad, you'll understand exactly why knights dreaded these moments. To soften the ordeal, rushes or straw were sometimes scattered across the floor, creating a thin buffer. Think of it as medieval carpeting, functional, fragrant, at least at first, and easily replaced. The rushes might be mixed with herbs like sweet flag, lavender, or chamomile, both to smell better and to deter vermin. But after a few weeks, trampled by boots and soaked with spilled ale, those rushes became less soft meadow and more mulch pile. Sleeping on them meant inhaling a strange cocktail of scents: smoke, herbs, damp straw, and a hint of last night's spilled stew. Not exactly lavender fields in Provence. Here's a quirky little fact. Travellers often carried their own bedding rolls called trusses. These were bundles of blankets or straw mats that could be laid down on any floor to make a makeshift bed. A knight on campaign might unroll his truss in a barracks, an inn, or even in a drafty hallway of the castle itself. Some records even mention travellers bringing personal straw sacks, which they'd stuff on arrival to avoid sleeping on communal pallets. So even medieval sleep had a kind of BYOB policy: bring your own bedding. Historians debate how often knights ended up in these floor-bound situations. Some argue it was rare for someone of knightly status to be denied a proper bed, especially within the walls of a castle. Others counter that the sheer number of mouths to house during feasts, campaigns, or emergencies meant beds were simply outnumbered. And while the noble knight might not often sprawl on bare stone, he certainly wasn't guaranteed featherbeds every night of his life. Now picture yourself as that unlucky knight. You've removed your armour, too tired to clean it, and it lies in a clinking heap beside you. Your cloak is spread beneath your back, offering a pitiful cushion against the rock-hard floor. The chill seeps upward, relentless. You curl tighter, trying to conserve heat, your knees pulled into your chest. Around you, the hall echoes with the sound of others breathing, snoring and shifting. Somewhere in the dark, a rat skitters, brushing against the rushes. You tuck the blanket over your head, hoping the morning comes quickly, and yet there was a strange kind of resilience built into this discomfort. Knights were trained to endure hardship, cold floors, sleepless nights, aching muscles. Sleeping rough was part of the job description, especially on campaign. It was a reminder that knighthood wasn't just glory in tournaments, it was also the humbler reality of aching hips and drafty corners. Maybe that's why so much of chivalric literature dwells on endurance. To be a knight meant accepting the stone floor as readily as the banquet table. So while some nights meant sinking into featherbeds and fur canopies, others meant curling into a cloak on rushes, listening to the floor steal your warmth inch by inch. In a castle, survival meant adaptation, and knights, hardened as they were, learned to drift into sleep even when comfort was a stranger. By now you've got a sense of the bedding, the fires, even the unlucky nights spent on stone. But let's dim the scene a little more, because there's one detail we haven't lingered on: the light. Or rather, the shadows that came with it. Imagine a medieval night without electricity, without LEDs, without even kerosene lamps. Darkness here was absolute, the kind that pressed against your skin, and when light appeared, whether from candles, torches, or the embers of a fire, it wasn't steady, it was flickering, shifting, almost alive. For a night trying to sleep, that half-light shaped the entire experience of the night. Candles were the main source, though not the neat dripless ones you buy at a modern store. Medieval candles were made of tallow, rendered animal fat. They smoked, they stank faintly of meat, and they dripped unevenly, leaving hardened blobs of wax on whatever surface they sat upon. Wealthier households sometimes splurged on beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and smelled faintly sweet, almost like honey. But even those were expensive, often saved for chapels or banquets. If you were a knight winding down at bedtime, odds were the light beside you was a greasy tallow candle sputtering in an iron holder. The problem wasn't just the smell. Candlelight shifted constantly, shadows dancing across the walls like restless spirits. Imagine lying in bed, trying to sleep, while the shadows stretched and shrank, bending into shapes your tired brain insisted looked like figures creeping across the chamber. You tell yourself it's nothing, the flicker of the wick, the smoke drifting upward, but it's easy to see why medieval people associated nighttime with demons and ghosts. The light itself seemed to encourage imagination to run wild. And then there was fire safety, or to be blunt, the lack of it. A candle knocked over could turn your bed into an inferno in minutes, especially with straw mattresses and fur blankets. Servants were sometimes tasked with snuffing out every flame before the household slept, but not everyone was diligent. Some people insisted on keeping a small light burning all night, believing it kept evil at bay. Others argued that leaving a candle burning was inviting disaster. It's one of those points of debate that still echoes in history. Was a knight's chamber safer in darkness, or with a risky flame left sputtering beside him? Here's a quirky fact. Medieval people often made use of rushlights, strips of dried rush plants dipped in fat, then lit like primitive candles. They were cheap, easy to make, and burned quickly, sometimes only lasting half an hour. Not exactly ideal for pulling an all-nighter, but handy for short bursts of light. Imagine your squire lighting a rushlight to help you unbuckle armour, only for the flame to gutter out before he's finished. Annoying, yes, but part of daily life. Scholars still debate just how much light a knight's chamber really had during the night. Some accounts suggest a single candle or torch was the norm, enough to create a glow, but not enough to truly illuminate the room. Others argue that wealthier castles with better supplies of beeswax and oil could afford multiple lights, creating a chamber that flickered like a chapel. But most agree, medieval darkness was deeper and heavier than what we know today, and a knight lying in bed would have been far more aware of every shadow, every movement, every whisper of wind. Now close your eyes and step into that chamber. You're lying under furs, the fire reduced to glowing embers. A single candle still burns, its light shivering against the stone walls. The bed curtains sway faintly in the draught, shadows dancing like figures just beyond reach. Every creak of wood sounds louder, every gust of wind feels like a hand brushing against the shutter. You pull the covers tighter and tell yourself it's nothing, but your eyes keep darting to the corner where the shadows seem thicker. The candle sputters, threatening to go out, and your heart quickens. And yet, there's something comforting too. The faint golden glow gives shape to the world, preventing the utter blindness of total night. The warmth of the embers flickers faintly, reminding you that you're not abandoned to the cold. You murmur a prayer, close your eyes, and will yourself to trust in the light, however small. Because here, in the medieval night, even a single candle feels like a shield. So while bedding and servants kept the body warm, it was candlelight and firelight that kept the mind steady. The night's rest wasn't just about escaping the cold, it was about navigating a world of shadows, where every flicker of flame could be either a comfort or a threat. And sometimes that fragile glow was the only thing standing between peaceful sleep and restless fear. You've got your bedding layered, your fire sputtering, and your candle trembling against the shadows. But now we arrive at a question you probably haven't asked. How exactly did knights position themselves when they finally lay down? It might sound obvious. You lie flat, pull the covers up, drift into dreamland. But in the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't always so straightforward. Ideas about posture, health, and even the symbolism of lying flat played into how a knight arranged his body in bed. The most common image we hold, someone stretched out on their back like a corpse, isn't actually what most medieval sleepers did. For one, lying perfectly flat was sometimes associated with death. Corpses were laid on their backs, hands folded, faces still. People feared that mimicking this posture while alive might invite death, or at the very least tempt spirits to mistake a sleeper for a soul ready to depart. Creepy. Absolutely. So knights, like most people of their time, often slept curled on their side, knees drawn up, hands tucked close to the chest, more like a fetus than a statue. But there's another wrinkle here. Some people actually believed it was healthier to sleep upright, or at least partially propped up. Beds were sometimes angled with bolsters or pillows that kept the upper body raised. The logic was medical, based on the theory of humours. Lying flat, doctors argued, could let bad vapours pool in the body, causing illness or suffocation. Sleeping upright, on the other hand, kept the head elevated, the breath steady, and the digestion flowing. If you've ever tried sleeping in a chair after overeating, you'll recognise the reasoning. In fact, some noble households even had bed frames designed to allow for slanted rest. Knights, particularly those with battle-worn bodies, might have appreciated this too. Imagine spending the day in chainmail, your back aching, your shoulders stiff. Lying flat on a straw mattress could feel brutal, each vertebra protesting. But propped up on pillows, well, they weren't goose feather luxuries, more like stuffed cloth sacks. You could at least ease the pressure and breathe more easily. Some knights may have leaned against the wooden headboard of their bed like modern-day readers propped against pillows, except instead of reading a novel, they were perhaps muttering prayers or dozing off to the sound of the wind in the shutters. Now here's the quirky fact of the night. There are medieval illustrations showing couples in bed, not lying flat but sitting slightly upright, sometimes even with their hats on. Yes, hats in bed. This wasn't just fashion, it was functional. Sleeping caps kept heat from leaking out, and sitting upright supposedly discouraged nightmares and indigestion. So imagine yourself, bonnet tied, cloak still around your shoulders, half sitting in bed like someone waiting for the world's longest doctor's appointment. Not exactly the image of knightly romance, but it worked. Of course, historians debate how much of this posture stuff was theory versus practice. Did most people actually sit upright through the night, or did they start upright and then slump down in exhaustion? Some argue the medical advice was just that, advice, often ignored by the bone-tired. Others point to the prevalence of angled beds and bolsters as evidence that people took the idea seriously. A knight, especially one conscious of his health and rank, might have been more likely to adopt the practice than a peasant with no pillows to spare. Picture the scene. You're the knight, sliding into bed after a feast. Your squire has piled 2 bolsters behind you, raising your upper body at a slant. You pull the furs up, tuck your arms in, and feel the fire's glow brushing against your face. You shift onto your side, curling your knees, settling into that fetal posture that keeps you warmer and more secure. Above you, the canopy curtains sway faintly, the shadows dance, and you breathe slow and steady, reassured that you aren't lying like a corpse inviting death's visit. And for those rare nights when you do slip onto your back, perhaps you wake with a start, heart racing, convinced that you felt a presence in the room, or maybe you snap awake because you've dreamed of lying in a coffin, vision shaped not just by imagination but by the constant association of flat sleep with death. No wonder people clung to their side positions, curled tight as if hugging life itself. So, while you might assume knights slept just as we do today, the truth is a little stranger. Their positions weren't just about comfort, they were tangled up in beliefs about health, symbolism, and even mortality. Side sleeping, propped up postures, bundled caps, all these formed part of the nightly ritual, a choreography of survival and superstition. And now, as you curl up tight under imagined wool and fur, think about the knight doing the same, knees to chest, head slightly raised, eyes darting at the candlelight shadows. Just another human trying to find peace in a cold, uncertain night. So far you've curled up under furs, propped yourself on bolsters, and even debated whether lying flat would trick death into showing up early. But here's where things get a little stranger. Once the knight actually fell asleep, what happened inside his head? Dreams and nightmares weren't brushed off as random firing neurons the way modern science explains them. In the medieval world, dreams were serious business. Messages, warnings, omens, sometimes even divine revelations. And for a knight, whose life was already steeped in religion, superstition and danger, what he dreamed could shape how he faced the next day. Medieval belief systems divided dreams into categories. Some were seen as divine visions, God or saints whispering guidance through the night. Others were blamed on demons, tricking the sleeper with false images or sinful temptations. And still others were considered the mere byproduct of what you'd eaten before bed. Yes, the don't eat cheese before sleep, or you'll have bad dreams advice has very medieval roots. Imagine a knight, stuffed full of roasted boar and heavy ale, collapsing onto his straw mattress, only to dream of grotesque battles or fiery demons. To him, that wasn't indigestion, it was a warning. There's a quirky little fact here. Medieval dream manuals actually existed. People wrote guides explaining how to interpret visions. Dream of a lion. That could mean courage, nobility, or divine favour. Dream of falling. A warning of spiritual decline. Dream of water. It might symbolise purity, or danger, depending on how muddy the water looked. Knights and nobles who were literate, or had chaplains nearby to do the reading, could consult these guides, treating their dreams almost like coded letters from the beyond. But scholars still debate how widespread these dream beliefs really were among everyday knights. Some argue that only the most educated circles truly indulged in detailed dream interpretation, while others suggest the ideas filtered down through sermons, folklore, and casual storytelling. After all, even if a knight couldn't read Latin treatises on dream symbolism, he could still hear tales at the hearth about visions foretelling victories or disasters. It's easy to imagine a knight whispering his dream to a squire in the morning, half joking, half serious, wondering if it meant something for the coming campaign. Now put yourself in that bed again. You're curled under blankets, head heavy, the last flicker of candlelight fading into dark. Your mind drifts. At first it's simple images, the sound of clashing steel, the warmth of the fire, the echo of laughter from the feast. But soon the dream sharpens. You see yourself on horseback riding into mist. Out of the fog, a black dog appears, its eyes glowing. You wake with a start, breath clouding in the icy air. In the medieval mindset, that wasn't just a nightmare, it was an omen. Dogs were often symbols of death. Do you tell anyone in the morning? Or do you shrug it off, hoping the symbolism fades like your sleep did? Nightmares were particularly feared. People believed they weren't just the mind's invention, but sometimes actual spirits pressing down on a sleeper's chest. The word nightmare itself comes from this idea. A mara, a malevolent spirit sitting on you while you slept, suffocating you, filling your mind with terror. Imagine the night waking in the dark, heart racing, convinced something heavy just crouched on his chest, then vanishing into the shadows. Today we call that sleep paralysis. Back then it was a demon paying a visit. Not all dreams were frightening though. Some were comforting, believed to be visions of departed loved ones or saints offering protection. A knight might wake reassured, convinced that his patron saint had blessed him, or that a deceased comrade had sent a message from beyond. In a world where death was ever present, such dreams offered a fragile thread of comfort. And dreams weren't just private, they became part of culture. Chivalric romances, those epic stories of knights and quests, often included dream sequences where heroes saw symbols of their destiny. A knight steeped in those tales couldn't help but measure his own dreams against the ones sung by troubadours. Was that vision of a tower crumbling just nonsense? Or was it a sign that the lord he served would soon fall? In the candlelit dawn, with breath still fogging in the chamber, such questions felt very real. So as you imagine yourself sinking into medieval sleep, remember, the knight didn't wake brushing off his dreams as random nonsense. He woke pondering their meaning, maybe whispering a prayer, maybe carrying a quiet unease through his morning routine. The cold stone walls weren't the only weight pressing in on him. The unseen world of dreams and nightmares carried its own chill. Dreams may have shaken the knight in his sleep, but what he did before lying down mattered just as much. In the medieval mind, nighttime wasn't simply a pause between days. It was a vulnerable crossing, a time when the soul was as exposed as the body. So before crawling into bed, many knights followed small rituals, weaving together religion, superstition and habit, in the hope of keeping both frost and fear at bay. The most obvious was prayer. Picture the knight kneeling at the side of his bed, hands clasped, whispering a paternoster or Ave Maria. He wasn't just asking for warmth, he was asking for protection. Medieval people firmly believed that night was when evil spirits prowled, when demons were most likely to slip through cracks in the walls or creep in through dreams. A prayer to St. Michael, the great warrior angel, or St. George, the dragon slayer, felt like surrounding yourself with invisible guards before surrendering to unconsciousness. Then there were the blessings of objects. A knight might hang a small crucifix above his bed, or keep a relic tucked under his pillow. Relics could be anything from a sliver of saintly bone to a scrap of cloth said to have touched a holy figure. Superstitious? Absolutely. But in a drafty chamber full of shadows, having a holy object nearby was reassurance that no phantom would dare crawl into the bed curtains. Some knights even slept with rosaries tangled around their wrists, as if to anchor themselves to divine power in case dreams turned dark. Quirky little charms also crept into the nightly routine. Herbal sachets, lavender for calm, rosemary for protection, fennel to ward off witches, might be tucked near the pillow. Some households embroidered tiny crosses into the corners of bed linens, believing this would bar demons from slipping beneath the covers. Imagine lying down with your scratchy wool blanket, noticing that a servant has stitched a little red cross into the hem. It wasn't stylish, it was a spiritual lock. Of course, not everyone agreed on how much ritual was enough. Scholarly theologians warned against putting too much faith in charms, saying prayers and sacraments should be enough. But folklore had its stubborn power, and knights, despite their education, lived in a world where villagers told stories of spirits sitting on sleepers' chests, or witches stealing men's breath at night. The debate lingers among historians even now. Were knights strictly pious in their routines, or did they blend prayers with bits of old folk magic, hedging their bets in the cold dark? Now picture yourself again. You've shed your armour, your squire has drawn the bed curtains, and you kneel on the cold floorboards. The draught brushes against your face as you murmur prayers, breath fogging in the candlelight. You slide under the blankets, making sure the small cross around your neck lies flat against your chest. In the corner, a sachet of rosemary gives off its faint peppery scent. Your hand strays to the little relic beneath your pillow, a pebble said to come from Jerusalem. You exhale, comforted by the weight of ritual, and finally close your eyes. And sometimes the rituals weren't just for protection from spirits, they were for protection from the body itself. Physicians advise certain bedtime prayers and postures to encourage good sleep and keep the humours balanced. Eat lightly before bed, pray to quiet the mind, Lie on your right side to encourage digestion. Was it science? Not in the modern sense, but it was part of a worldview where the physical and spiritual were braided tightly together. Another curious note: some knights, especially during campaign, may have shared their nighttime prayers aloud with squires or comrades. Imagine a group of armoured men, bedding down on straw in a drafty hall, each whispering a short blessing before pulling their cloaks tight. The communal mutter of prayer must have filled the dark with a strange, humming comfort, like a chorus against the night. So while bedding and fires kept the knight's body alive, it was ritual that wrapped his mind in warmth. In that world of shifting shadows, the tiniest gestures, crossing oneself before sleep, tucking a charm under the pillow, whispering a prayer into the cold air, were the real defences against the unseen. And with those defences in place, the knight could finally surrender to the strange, perilous realm of medieval dreams. We've talked about beds, blankets, prayers, and even rosemary sachets, but there's an elephant in the room, or rather, a pile of clanking metal on the floor. What happened to a knight's armour when he finally lay down for the night? After all, that stuff wasn't just heavy, it was sweaty, smelly, and definitely not the kind of thing you wanted to cuddle under your blankets. Yet it was also his lifeline, the one possession standing between him and a blade. Deciding what to do with armour was as much a nighttime ritual as pulling up the furs. First, let's dispel a Hollywood image. Knights didn't sleep in their armour. Sure, a desperate situation, like a siege or sudden raid, might force someone to doze off still half-armoured, but generally armour was too restrictive to rest in. Imagine trying to curl up on straw while wearing 25 kilograms of steel. The plates would dig into your ribs, the mail would pinch at your skin, and the helmet would rattle with every breath. You wouldn't sleep. You'd suffer. So off it came, piece by piece, in a kind of nightly undressing ceremony. A squire usually handled this. Picture the scene. The knight stands weary after a day's training or patrol, arms hanging heavy. The squire kneels, unlacing greaves, slipping off gauntlets, easing the breastplate away from aching shoulders. Each piece comes loose with a soft metallic sigh, stacked neatly on a bench or hung carefully on pegs driven into the chamber wall. Mail shirts might be draped over wooden stands to air out, since stuffing them into a heap only made the rings rust faster. Helmets often got their own little space, sometimes padded with cloth to protect the lining. Of course, this wasn't just about neatness, it was strategy. Armour needed to be close at hand in case of a midnight alarm. If the castle horn sounded, a knight had to suit up in minutes. That meant the squire had to lay everything in order, sometimes in a ritualised fashion. Greaves here, breastplate there, sword always within arm's reach. You didn't want to fumble in the dark trying to remember where you tossed your vambraces. It wasn't unlike a firefighter today laying out boots and gear before bed, prepared for sudden chaos. Here's a quirky fact. Some knights even slept with their swords or daggers under the bed or tucked beside them. Not in the sheets, nobody wanted to roll over onto a blade, but close enough to grab in an instant. It was a symbol of status, yes, but also a reminder that danger could erupt at any moment. Imagine drifting into sleep with the reassuring weight of a dagger's hilt just inches from your hand, cold metal waiting like a silent guardian. But historians argue about how pristine these nightly rituals really were. Some suggest knights of higher status enjoyed the luxury of careful squires, polished armour, and neatly arranged gear. Others point out that on campaign or in crowded halls, armour often ended up in a messy heap near the bedding, only half cleaned and already beginning to stink of rust and sweat. Archaeological finds back this up. Armour fragments often show pitting and wear that suggest less than perfect maintenance. The neat chamber arrangement may have been the ideal but not the universal practice. Now picture yourself again, this time as the night after battle. You lower yourself onto a stool, the squire tugging at stubborn straps, mail jingling as it sloughs off your body. Your tunic beneath is damp with sweat, clinging uncomfortably in the cold air. Piece by piece, your body feels lighter. When the final gorget comes off, you exhale in relief, rubbing at raw patches on your shoulders. The squire sets the breastplate carefully against the wall, the firelight glinting off its dented surface. Your sword rests against the bedside, hilt tilted within easy reach. You slide into bed lighter, freer, but with the quiet reassurance that your armour is waiting if needed. Armour storage wasn't only functional, it could be ceremonial. In some households, knightly gear was displayed like trophies, polished and set out for all to see. In others, it was treated more practically, with racks and hooks crowding the chamber. Either way, the presence of armour in a bedroom was constant. Imagine trying to fall asleep while the faint metallic smell of iron mingled with the smoke of the fire and the lavender tucked in the rushes. Even at rest, the knight's world was never far from steel, and sometimes, in those long, restless hours of a freezing night, the knight might glance at the pile of armour gleaming faintly in the candlelight. It was more than equipment, it was identity. Proof that he was not just another man on the floor of the hall. His armour made him who he was, even as he lay stripped of it, curled under wool and fur, vulnerable like anyone else. So far your chamber feels almost peaceful. The fire sputters, the armour rests neatly by the wall, and your squire has retreated to his own pallet. But the castle at night wasn't silent, and it certainly wasn't clean. Alongside the prayers, the bedding, and the crackle of fire came something far less glamorous. Pests. Castles were not sterile fortresses, they were living, breathing ecosystems of stone, straw, and unfortunately, rats. Imagine lying there, finally warm enough under your blankets when you hear it. A faint scratching sound along the floorboards, the rushes rustling as something small scuttles past. It isn't your imagination. Castles, with their storerooms of grain, refuse piles and endless nooks in the stonework, were havens for rodents. Rats and mice slipped in through cracks, gnawed at wooden chests and darted under beds. They were as much a part of nightly life as the draught from the shutters, and rodents didn't come alone. Fleas, lice and bedbugs were their constant companions. No matter how carefully servants changed rushes or aired mattresses, infestations were inevitable. A knight could go to bed with furs piled high and linen sheets freshly laid out, only to wake itching at bites from invisible enemies. Herbal sachets, lavender, wormwood, pennyroyal, were meant to drive them away, and sometimes small dogs or cats were kept precisely to hunt them. Still, the scratching noises and faint squeaks never truly disappeared. Here's a quirky fact. In some chronicles, rats in castles are described almost like unofficial residents, scurrying openly during feasts, stealing scraps, and even bold enough to run across sleeping bodies in the Great Hall. Imagine being the knight on campaign, lying in a crowded barracks, when a rat decides your blanket looks like a good climbing frame. Not exactly the noble bedtime story sung by troubadours. The debate among historians is whether these vermin were seen simply as nuisances or as outright health threats. Some argue that medieval people were so accustomed to pests that they barely noticed them, treating fleas and rats as part of life. Others point out that sources do mention efforts to control infestations. Herbs scattered, rushes changed, even cats kept in kitchens and storerooms. And after the devastation of the Black Death in the 14th century, which spread through fleas carried by rats, the association between vermin and disease became undeniable. For knights of earlier centuries, however, rats were more likely to be viewed as bothersome bedfellows than mortal threats. Now imagine yourself in that chamber again. You're curled under your furs, half asleep, when a faint scuttle near your ear makes your eyes snap open. You hold still, listening. A soft squeak, then the sound of claws against stone. You tug the blankets tighter, trying not to imagine whiskers brushing against your cheek in the dark. Somewhere near the fire, the squire shifts in his sleep, maybe swatting at a flea. You exhale, telling yourself it's nothing, but your heart takes a little longer to settle. And it wasn't just rodents. Insects thrived in the warmth of bedding. Bedbugs could infest straw mattresses so deeply that no amount of shaking would rid them. Lice found homes in hair and clothing, hitching rides no matter how noble you were. The knight's linen nightshirt, meant to provide a clean barrier, often doubled as a scratching post by morning. Imagine starting your day by running a comb through your hair to scrape out the night's unwelcome visitors. Not exactly shining armour and glory. Yet there was resilience in this too. People developed tolerance, jokes, even folk remedies. Stories circulate of knights teasing squires about their constant scratching, or blaming bad dreams on the fleas dancing a jig in the bed. Superstition sprang up. Scratching noises at night could also be spirits, not rats. So best to say a prayer before cursing the sound. Humour, faith, and sheer endurance blurred together, helping people cope with realities we'd find unbearable today. So the knight's night wasn't only a struggle against cold or shadows, it was a battle against the small, relentless creatures sharing his chamber. And in some ways, Those tiny scratching sounds in the rushes may have been more unsettling than the howling wind outside. The enemy at night wasn't always a raiding army. It was often just a rat, bold enough to claim part of the bedchamber for itself. You've pulled the furs tighter, tried to ignore the scratching in the rushes, and finally found a rhythm to your breathing. But sleep in a medieval castle was never completely private. Even if your chamber was quiet, the building itself was alive with noises, and some of the loudest came from the men stationed outside, guards patrolling the walls, watchmen pacing the courtyards, and the ever-present sound of horns and bells piercing the dark. For a night, those sounds weren't just background. They were reminders that the world beyond the bed was never entirely safe. The night watch was one of the most important duties in a fortress. Guards took turns patrolling battlements, lanterns swinging, boots crunching on frost or snow. At regular intervals, they were required to call out, announce the hour, or sound a horn to prove they were awake. Imagine lying in your chamber, half asleep, when you hear a distant voice echo through the stone. All's well! Maybe it comforts you, proof that the walls are guarded, or maybe it reminds you of the very dangers that make such vigilance necessary. Either way, it pulls you halfway out of your dreams, and then there were the horns. If a watchman spotted something suspicious, shadows moving in the woods, the glint of steel in torchlight, he blew into a curved horn that blasted through the night. For a night in bed, that sound meant one thing: get up. No matter how warm you were, no matter how deep in sleep, the horn jolted you awake with the knowledge that you might have to be in armour within minutes. It was the medieval equivalent of a blaring alarm siren, though instead of car accidents or fires, it meant arrows, swords, or siege engines. Here's a quirky fact. In some castles, watchmen also rang bells every hour, marking time through the night. It wasn't only for defence, it was also for prayer schedules, especially in castles attached to monasteries or with chapels. So you might find yourself drifting in and out of sleep, half dreaming, half listening to the toll of iron bells ringing through the icy darkness. To us it might feel like constant interruption. To them it was structure, reassurance, and the rhythm of life. Of course, historians debate how disruptive these sounds truly were. Some suggest knights, accustomed to the constant noise of communal living, barely noticed the calls and horns after a while, treating them like background noise. Others argue that the echoing architecture of castles made every sound thunderous, rattling through chambers and halls. A horn blast in the courtyard might have felt like it was right at your bedside. Perhaps the truth depends on where you slept. Deep inside a curtained bed in a private chamber, or sprawled in the great hall with nothing between you and the racket but a thin wool blanket. Now imagine yourself there. You've drifted into uneasy sleep, your knees curled tight under the blankets. Suddenly, a horn cuts through the night, so loud it vibrates in your chest. You jolt awake, heart pounding, fumbling for the sword at your side. The sound dies away, replaced by shouts echoing across the walls. You wait, breath held, listening. Minutes later, silence returns. Maybe it was a false alarm, maybe not. But now you lie wide awake, the cold pressing in, your mind racing through visions of enemies massing just beyond the gates. And not all interruptions were so dramatic. Sometimes it was just the tramp of boots as a watchman passed below, or the bark of dogs startled by movement in the woods. Owls hooted, winds howled, shutters rattled. The castle was never silent. It was a chorus of reminders that the outside world pressed close. Even in the supposed safety of stone walls, you were never fully insulated from threat. For a night, that half-awareness became second nature, a readiness trained into his body. Yet there was a comfort in it too. Knowing others kept watch allowed the night to surrender, however briefly to rest. The sound of a guard's horn, when not alarming, was like a lullaby of vigilance, proof that someone else was awake so you didn't have to be. It was the paradox of medieval sleep, disturbed constantly, yet grounded in the reassurance that danger would not come unnoticed. So while the night curled under blankets and muttered prayers against demons, the real world intruded with its own voices: horns, bells, footsteps, barks. Sleep was never silence. It was always a dialogue between the inner chamber and the walls beyond. By now you've heard the horns echo, felt the shadows flicker, and tried not to scratch at phantom fleas. But here's another thing shaping a knight's night: the state of his stomach. Food, or the lack of it, played a huge role in how well someone slept through the cold. If you've ever gone to bed on an empty stomach, you know the hollow ache that keeps you awake. Now imagine that in a castle chamber, with icy draughts for company. Knights weren't immune to hunger, and what they ate before bed often determined whether the night was tolerable or miserable. Meals in a castle followed the rhythm of the day. The main feast was usually held midday, with a lighter supper in the evening. On good days, this meant roasted meat, thick stews, bread fresh from the oven, and maybe even spiced wine. But on leaner days, or during campaigns, supper could be nothing more than stale bread dipped in broth or a hunk of salted fish. Going to bed after a feast left the night warm, heavy, and sometimes plagued by bizarre dreams. Going to bed after scraps left him shivering, his body burning through what little fuel he had. There's a curious medieval belief that directly links digestion to sleep. Physicians following Galen's humoral theory argued that heavy food at night weighed down the body, trapping vapours and causing nightmares. Yet fasting before bed could leave the body too cold and unbalanced. The sweet spot, they said, was a modest portion, enough to warm the stomach, but not enough to overwhelm it. Easier said than done when your lord decided how much bread you got or when the cook miscalculated portions. Here's a quirky fact. Some knights believed that cheese, in particular, caused strange dreams. Medieval texts warn that eating cheese late in the evening might stir up troubling visions. Was it lactose intolerance before its time? Maybe. Or maybe it was just the dense, heavy nature of aged cheese sitting poorly on a medieval stomach. Imagine a knight muttering that his nightmare of demons last night was because someone served too much hard cheese after supper. Blame the dairy, not the devil. Historians still argue how consistent nightly diets were in peacetime versus campaign. Some say castle pantries were well stocked enough that hunger was rare, while others point out that winters, sieges and poor harvests could leave even noble households rationing food. For a knight on patrol or garrison duty, a supper of cold bread and watered ale wasn't unusual. That meant long nights with a belly growling louder than the rats in the rafters. Now put yourself in the scene. You've had a feast tonight. Venison stew, bread, a cup of spiced wine. Your stomach feels warm as you slip into bed. Sleep comes easily, though your dreams turn vivid. Colours sharper, images stranger, as though your body is protesting the indulgence. On another night, though, you've had little more than thin pottage, the broth barely thick enough to coat a spoon. You curl into the blankets, but your stomach gnaws, echoing every time the wind rattles the shutters. Sleep won't come, or if it does, it's shallow and broken. And hunger wasn't just physical, it was psychological. A knight had to be prepared for long campaigns where food was scarce, where even bread hardened into stone before it could be eaten. Training in endurance meant learning to ignore hunger, to find focus in fasting. But at night, in the silence of the chamber, there was no distraction. The emptiness gnawed, a reminder that all the furs and prayers in the world couldn't replace a full stomach. So much of medieval sleep, in fact, was tied to the rhythms of food. Supper warmed the body, or left it restless. Ale dulled the mind, or made it stumble into heavy dreams. A hungry night became a cold one, while a fed night might at least feel insulated against the draught. It was another of those invisible variables that decided whether the night was survivable, or one long stretch of waking misery. So the knight's bed wasn't just a battle against cold and shadows, it was a truce negotiated with his own stomach, and on the coldest nights, hunger was sometimes the fiercest enemy of all. It's one thing to battle rats, draughts and an empty stomach, but nothing unsettled a knight's night more than the creeping spectre of sickness. Winter in a medieval castle wasn't just cold, it was dangerous. The damp air, the constant draughts, the smoky hearths all worked together to wear down even the strongest bodies. And once the body cracked under the strain, there were no antibiotics or cosy hospitals waiting. Illnesses that today might cost you a week of bed rest could carry a night off entirely. So when he climbed into bed on the coldest nights, he wasn't just fending off discomfort, he was fighting for his health. The most common threat was the chill itself. Pneumonia, fevers, chills, and catarrh, basically every cough and cold rolled into one, were frequent visitors in the winter months. Imagine lying down in a drafty chamber, the cold air cutting across your throat and chest, only to wake hours later wheezing with a cough that wouldn't quit. Physicians of the time believed that night air was especially dangerous, carrying miasmas that poisoned the body. That belief wasn't entirely wrong. Cold air and poor ventilation certainly did nothing to prevent infections. Then there were the smoky fires. We've already pictured those braziers and tallow candles filling the room with haze. Prolonged exposure meant irritated lungs, watery eyes, even chronic breathing problems. A knight might fall asleep comforted by the fire, only to wake hacking from smoke that clung to his blankets. In an age without inhalers, that cough could linger for months, wearing him down until his body was ripe for worse infections. Here's a quirky detail. Some medieval physicians actually recommended sleeping with onions or garlic nearby to purify the air and ward off illness. Imagine tucking into your bed curtains and finding a bulb of garlic dangling above your head like a vampire deterrent. Odd, maybe, but it spoke to a genuine fear that the unseen air itself was plotting against you. Historians debate just how much these illnesses shaped knightly life. Some argue that knights, used to outdoor training and hard living, developed resilience that let them shrug off colds and chills more easily than modern city dwellers. Others suggest the constant exposure, poor diet in winters, and lack of medical understanding left them far more vulnerable. Accounts of knights dying young, felled not by swords but by winter fevers, support the second view. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Toughness helped, but even the toughest knight couldn't outrun pneumonia in a drafty castle. Picture it for yourself. You're in bed, wrapped under furs, and yet you can't get warm. Your chest feels tight, every breath scratching your throat. The fire smoulders, filling the air with smoke, your eyes sting. You cough, trying not to wake the squire sleeping nearby. Each cough rattles your body, making you sweat despite the cold. You whisper a prayer, not just for warmth now, but for survival until dawn. Because you know that too many nights like this could turn into something far deadlier than a chilly draught. An illness didn't only strike the body, it haunted the mind. Medieval medicine taught that sickness could be caused by unbalanced humours, by sinful living, even by demons attacking the body at night. Imagine the guilt and fear layered over the physical misery. A knight coughing into his blanket might also whisper confessions, begging forgiveness just in case his sickness was punishment rather than chance. The weight of belief turned every fever into a spiritual crisis as much as a physical one. Yet amidst this fragility there was resilience. Some households used thick bed curtains, herbs scattered on the floor, or even woolen caps to keep sickness at bay. Hot drinks, mulled wine, spiced ale, or warm broth were given at bedtime to fight the cold from within. These comforts weren't cures, but they helped. They gave a knight something to hold on to in the face of an invisible enemy that slipped in with the frost. So when we imagine the medieval knight drifting off to sleep, we can't separate it from the lurking dread of illness. The stone walls promised safety from arrows and invaders, but they offered no defence against the slow, quiet danger of winter fevers. In the silence of the chamber, every cough echoed louder than the wind, reminding him that even the bravest warrior could be undone not by battle, but by the breath of the cold night itself. So you've survived the scratching rats, the smoky fires, and the threat of winter fevers. You've even managed a little sleep curled up in your fetal posture, under layers of wool and fur. But here's the thing, a knight's night was rarely uninterrupted. Just when the warmth began to settle into your bones, duty had a habit of barging in. Midnight interruptions were as much a part of life as prayers at dawn. And for a knight, sleep wasn't a guaranteed luxury. It was something loaned, ready to be snatched away at a moment's notice. The first and most obvious interruption was military. Castles were designed as fortresses, which meant that alarms could sound at any hour. The blast of a watchman's horn or the crash of a bell could yank a knight out of bed, forcing him to scramble into his armour before he was fully awake. Imagine the chaos. Servants rushing with torches, dogs barking, squires fumbling with straps, all while the knight tries to shake off sleep and remember where he left his helmet. In those moments, it didn't matter if you were warm or comfortable. The only priority was readiness. But not all interruptions were so dire. Sometimes the call came from the chapel. Castles with chaplains often followed a monastic rhythm, ringing bells to mark the canonical hours, matins, lauds, and so on. These services happened even in the deep of night. While knights weren't monks bound by strict obligation, many participated when possible, especially on holy days or during Lent. Imagine being dragged from bed at 2 a.m. to kneel on cold stone floors, breath misting in the candlelight, chanting prayers you could barely keep your eyes open for. Sacred, yes, but also exhausting. Here's a quirky fact. Some records show that castles, like monasteries, operated on what we'd call segmented sleep. People often slept in 2 shifts, with a waking period in the middle of the night. During that interval, they might pray, read, tend the fire, or even talk with whoever shared their chamber. It wasn't strange to get up around midnight, sip a little wine, and then return to bed for a second sleep. So a night's interruptions weren't always dramatic. They could be part of the normal rhythm of the night. But historians still debate how widespread this segmented sleep pattern was. Was it truly universal, or more common in religious communities and noble households? Some argue that peasants and soldiers simply collapsed from exhaustion and slept straight through, while wealthier classes observed the 2-sleep rhythm more carefully. For knights, it likely depended on context. In campaign tents, sleep was probably snatched whenever possible. In a castle with bells and chapels nearby, the rhythm of waking and returning to bed may have been more common. Now imagine yourself in that moment. You've been asleep for a few hours and suddenly a servant is shaking your shoulder. "Matins," he whispers. Your bones protest as you swing your legs out from under the blankets. The chamber air bites your skin. You throw on a cloak, tug a cap down over your ears, and shuffle toward the chapel with a handful of other bleary figures. The flicker of torches lines the hallway. The sound of chanting begins in the distance. By the time you return to bed, your toes are numb, but your soul feels faintly steadier. And sometimes the interruptions were far more personal. A messenger arriving late, pounding on the gate with urgent news. A lord calling his knights to a council at midnight, strategizing by firelight. Or even domestic disturbances, quarrels, drunken singing in the hall, servants clattering as they tended to fires. Castles were not silent cloisters. They were bustling communities, and a knight's chamber was rarely cut off from the noise. Sleep came in fragments, stolen between the interruptions of daily duty. But perhaps the strangest interruption of all was inward. A knight, trained for vigilance, often woke at the faintest sound, an instinct honed from years of being ready for danger. The clatter of a rat in the rushes, the sigh of the wind in the chimney, the bark of a hound outside, all could jolt him awake, heart pounding, hand reaching instinctively for the dagger by the bed. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival reflex. And in a world where danger might come at any hour, it was a habit that saved lives. So the night's night was never one seamless stretch of peaceful slumber. It was broken, fractured, punctuated by horns, bells, whispers, or footsteps in the hall. Each interruption carried its own meaning, divine duty, martial duty, or just the restless hum of castle life. Sleep wasn't something you owned. It was something you borrowed in intervals, always knowing it might be taken back before dawn. So far you've heard the horns, coughed through the smoke and dragged yourself to chapel at midnight. But let's take a quieter turn, because sometimes the interruptions of a night's night weren't about alarms or prayers, they were about emotions. For all their armour and bravado, knights were still human, and in the cold solitude of a chamber, or the cramped closeness of a great hall, many wrestled not just with draughts and fleas, but with loneliness. And with loneliness came the letters, the tokens, and the thoughts of the people they missed. Romanticised as they were, knights were often absent from home, on campaign, in service to a lord, or bound to garrison duty in some fortress far from their families. That meant long nights separated from spouses, lovers, children, or even the village friends who once shared their youth. The bed, whether it was feather-stuffed luxury or a straw sack in a corner, often felt emptier for the absence of familiar company. And when the fire sank low and the chamber went quiet, memories and longings had a way of filling the space. Love letters, when they existed, were prized like relics. Literacy wasn't universal among knights, but many had clerks or chaplains who could help write or read them. Picture a knight unfolding a worn piece of parchment by candlelight, the ink already smudged, the words read so often they lived in memory. Be safe, return soon. That letter, tucked under a pillow or kept in a pouch, was warmer than any fur blanket. Not every knight had such luxury, of course. Some carried only a token, a ribbon, a ring, a scrap of embroidered cloth. But in the frozen dark, those small objects pulsed with meaning. Here's a quirky fact. Chivalric literature often described knights sleeping with their lady's token beside them, sometimes even wearing it in battle as a charm. It wasn't just romance, it was superstition. A lock of hair tied into a ribbon could ward off fear, just as much as a relic or charm. Imagine yourself sliding into bed, your dagger at one side, and on the other a silk ribbon, frayed at the edges but treasured beyond measure. The steel guarded your body, the ribbon guarded your heart. Historians debate how widespread this really was. Were all knights secretly clutching love tokens under their pillows, or was this more a literary trope, magnified by troubadours and poets? Some argue that in reality, knights were more pragmatic, more focused on duty than on sentimental tokens. Others suggest that the line between literature and life was thin, and that knights, steeped in the ideals of courtly love, truly did bring these little rituals into their nightly routines. The truth, as usual, is likely a blend. Some knights were hardened by fatigue and indifference, others softened by the memory of someone waiting at home. Now picture the chamber again. The fire has faded to embers, your squire snores faintly in the corner. You lie awake, staring at the canopy above, fingers brushing a token under your pillow. Maybe it's a folded letter, maybe a bit of cloth with her scent still clinging faintly after months apart. You whisper her name into the darkness, hoping the cold stone walls carry it softly rather than swallow it whole. The ache in your chest is sharper than the drafts at your feet. You're a knight, trained for war, yet here in the stillness your greatest battle is against loneliness. And it wasn't only lovers. Knights sometimes longed for brothers in arms lost to battle, comrades who'd once shared laughter in the hall or snores on campaign nights. Memories of them slipped into dreams and sometimes into prayers before bed. Loneliness wasn't just about romance. It was about absence in general, the empty space left by people whose voices should have filled the night. Even companionship in the hall could highlight the gap. Surrounded by men sharing laughter, boasting of conquests, or trading jests, a knight might smile outwardly, while inwardly wishing for the quieter comfort of a familiar voice from home. The bed became both refuge and reminder, refuge from duty, reminder of distance. So in those coldest nights, warmth wasn't only physical, it was emotional, drawn from scraps of parchment, threads of ribbon, the memory of a kiss, or the imagined weight of a loved one beside you. For all the steel and furs, the true insulation often came from longing and the hope of reunion. And when sleep finally came, it carried both ache and solace, wrapping the night not just in wool, but in memory. You've clutched a ribbon beneath the blankets, whispered a name into the dark, and tried to soothe the ache of distance. But sometimes, comfort came not from memory or prayer, it came in a cup. A knight's nightcap wasn't a knitted bonnet this time, but a drink. Ale, wine, or spiced concoctions slipped down before bed were as much part of the nightly ritual as prayers or furs, and on the coldest nights, that cup could mean the difference between shivering awake and drifting into heavy, dream-thick slumber. Ale was the staple, not the frothy pints you picture at a tavern today, but a rough, often cloudy brew, low in alcohol compared to modern beers. It was cheap, plentiful, and considered safer than water, since boiling in the brewing process killed off many pathogens. A knight's servant might bring a small tankard to the chamber at night, the liquid still faintly warm if freshly brewed. A few gulps dulled the edge of hunger, eased the chill and loosened stiff muscles. Wine, though, was the true nightcap of choice for those who could afford it. Imported from France or Spain, it was often watered down, but for nighttime comfort it might be warmed and spiced. Imagine a steaming cup of mulled wine, red, heavy with cinnamon, cloves, maybe even honey. Sweet, heady, it rolled down the throat and left the body glowing. And in an age where medicine was half food and half prayer, mulled wine was praised as both remedy and comfort. A knight with a cough might be prescribed it, but let's be honest, it was also just a good excuse to drink before bed. Quirky fact, honeyed wine or mead was sometimes considered not just a luxury but a love potion. Couples drank it after weddings, giving us the term honeymoon. But in the cold silence of a castle night, mead could just as easily be a solitary comfort, a sweet blanket for the spirit. Picture yourself wrapped in wool, cradling a wooden cup of golden mead, the firelight catching the surface. You sip slowly, feeling warmth spread outward from your chest, seeping into fingers and toes. Of course, alcohol wasn't only comfort, it had consequences. Too much ale left a knight stumbling into bed, his snores echoing through the hall, his bladder ensuring he'd be up before dawn. Too much wine left dreams twisted and feverish, sometimes mistaken for visions or omens. And just like today, the morning after was rarely pleasant. Imagine waking with a pounding head, the fire long dead, the chamber freezing, and a squire nudging you awake for dawn duties. That hangover wasn't softened by ibuprofen. It was endured with groans and perhaps another small medicinal cup to steady the hands. Historians debate how heavily knights truly drank before bed. Some accounts portray evenings of feasting and merriment, cups flowing freely until half the household collapsed in drunken piles. Others suggest moderation was more common, with strong drink reserved for celebrations, while ordinary nights featured watered ale or thin wine. The truth likely shifted with wealth, occasion, and the lord's temperament. A stern master might forbid excess, while another encouraged it to foster camaraderie. For a knight, the nightly cup could be ritual, luxury, or outright necessity, depending on where and when he laid his head. Now imagine the scene in your chamber. The feast is over, and servants slip in quietly with cups of steaming spiced wine. The smell of cinnamon fills the air, clashing with the lingering smoke of the hearth. You take a long swallow, sighing as the warmth spreads. Your squire sets his own smaller cup aside, already nodding off in the corner. The firelight blurs, your eyelids grow heavy, and you surrender to the haze, less aware of the cold creeping through the shutters. But sometimes, that cup wasn't indulgence, it was necessity. On campaign nights, when frost bit harder than blankets could fight, ale or wine dulled the shivers enough to allow a few hours of rest. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't noble, but it worked. And in a world where comfort was rare, knights learned to accept every trick available, even if it came in the form of a sloshing, smoky mug. So in the cold stone silence of a medieval night, the knight's last companion was often liquid. Not just prayer, not just memory, but the glowing weight of ale, mead, or wine spreading warmth through a body already braced for discomfort. And when the cup was drained, the knight pulled the furs close, muttered one final prayer, and slipped into a sleep as thick and heavy as the drink that carried him there. So far we've nestled into the castle chambers, warmed by furs and firelight, distracted by horns and half-drunk cups of mulled wine. But knights didn't always have the luxury of sleeping within stone walls. Travel was part of their lives. Pilgrimages, campaigns, tournaments, patrols, and that meant sleep was often snatched in less forgiving places. Imagine leaving the castle comforts behind, and bedding down in a monastery guest room, a drafty roadside inn, or, most harsh of all, out in the field. These nights redefined cold in ways the castle almost protected you from. Take the monastery first. When knights travelled, monasteries were among the few reliable havens, offering food, shelter, and beds. But don't picture a cosy Airbnb. Guest chambers were sparse, wooden pallets, thin blankets, maybe a straw mattress if you were lucky. Monks lived in austerity, and guests were expected to adapt. Supper was light, the prayers endless, and silence enforced after dark. A knight used to feasts and noisy great halls might find the stillness unsettling, the echo of his own breathing louder than he'd ever noticed. And yet, there was a strange comfort in the rhythm of bells and chanting, even if it meant waking at odd hours to the sound of monks shuffling to matins in the chapel. Roadside inns were another matter. They were often crowded, smoky and filthy, with travellers of every rank crammed together. Inns rarely had enough beds. Most offered shared pallets or simple straw on the floor. Picture a knight, proud in armour by day, reduced at night to jostling with merchants, pilgrims and peasants for a patch of space near the fire. Ale flowed freely, arguments broke out, snores filled the air. Privacy? Forget it. Inns were chaotic melting pots, where fleas, spilled wine and the occasional brawl ensured that rest was a generous term. And then came campaign nights, the toughest of all. Sleeping rough in a field or forest, knights relied on cloaks, tents, and sheer endurance. A cloak might double as both bedding and blanket, spread over frozen ground or muddy earth. Fires were lit if possible, but in enemy territory they might risk drawing attention. That meant cold nights with little more than body heat and courage to keep men from freezing. Squires huddled near their masters, horses stamped restlessly nearby, and the ground sucked warmth from every limb. If the castle was a stone refrigerator, the open field was an icebox with no walls at all. Here's a quirky fact. Some knights carried small folding camp beds, wooden frames with stretched fabric, to keep them off the damp ground. They were rare, expensive, and mostly reserved for leaders or nobles, but they did exist. Everyone else? They made do with straw, cloaks, or simply bare earth. Accounts describe men waking stiff and sore, their armour frozen solid from frost if left out overnight. Imagine tugging on a mail shirt that crackles with ice while your breath hangs like smoke. Morning after campaign nights wasn't glorious, it was gritty. Historians debate how often knights actually slept rough versus finding shelter. Some suggest castles, monasteries, and manor houses were common enough that true outdoor nights were rarer than we think. Others argue that long campaigns, poor weather, and constant travel meant rough sleeping was the rule, not the exception. Either way, it was part of the nightly experience, proof that beneath the romance of chivalry lay the reality of frostbitten toes and aching backs. Now put yourself there. You're not in a castle chamber tonight. You're in a canvas tent, the wind clawing at the sides. The fire outside has died to embers, and your squire snores softly at your feet. You curl tighter into your cloak, the ground unforgiving beneath you. Your sword rests nearby, your horse stamps outside, and every rustle in the darkness makes you jolt awake, hand on the hilt. Sleep comes in fragments, broken by the cold, by fear, by the simple discomfort of earth and straw. By dawn you rise more tired than when you lay down, but ready, or at least forced, to keep marching. So whether it was the silence of a monastery, the chaos of an inn, or the misery of a frozen field, travel meant a knight had to adapt. The comforts of a castle chamber felt far away, almost unreal, and in those moments a knight's resilience wasn't measured by his armour or sword. It was measured by how well he endured the long cold night without walls. By now you've slept in halls, in chambers, and even on frozen fields. But one of the most curious truths about a knight's night isn't about where he slept, but how long. Medieval sleep didn't always match our modern 8-hour block. In fact, for much of Europe, nights followed a rhythm of what we now call two-phase sleep. Long winter darkness, combined with different ideas of time and health, meant people often slept in 2 shifts with a waking period in between. For a knight, this rhythm shaped the very texture of the night. Imagine this. The knight lies down not long after supper, wrapped in his furs by 8 or 9 o'clock. The fire still burns, the squire has tucked everything in order, and soon the chamber is quiet. He falls into the first sleep, heavy and deep, carried by the warmth of the wine and exhaustion from the day. A few hours pass, 3, maybe 4. Then, almost naturally, he wakes. Not with alarm, not from rats or horns, but simply because that's what bodies did. During this interval, called the watch, or the waking, people stirred in the darkness. Some prayed quietly, whispering to saints or thumbing rosaries. Others tended fires, added logs, checked on animals, or even slipped outside to relieve themselves in the biting cold. Couples might speak softly, or more intimately during this window. For knights, it could be a time to reflect, to plan, or to murmur with squires about the duties of the coming day. It wasn't wasted time, it was part of the night's rhythm. Here's the quirky fact. We have records of doctors actually recommending this two-phase sleep as healthy. The first sleep was for deep rest, the waking was for reflection, or even study, and the second sleep carried you gently into dawn. It was so common that people referred to first sleep and second sleep casually, as though everyone understood. Imagine rolling over and telling your squire, "Wake me after the second sleep," without either of you thinking it odd. But historians debate whether this practice was universal. Some argue that only in rural areas, with longer nights and fewer distractions, did people naturally divide sleep this way. Others suggest it was widespread in both villages and castles, a natural response to 12 or 14 hours of winter darkness. For knights, who lived with rigid duties, it may have been less consistent. Campaigns demanded whatever sleep could be stolen, while castle life allowed for more predictable rhythms. Now picture the knight's chamber at midnight. He wakes after his first sleep, breath fogging in the air. The fire has sunk low, the candle has guttered to a pool of wax. He stirs, pulls a cloak tighter, maybe sits up to say a prayer. His squire rolls over with a groan, muttering something incoherent. The knight rises quietly, adds a log to the fire and watches the flames spark. For a moment, the chamber is peaceful, the outside world muffled, the stone walls cocooning him in solitude. He might take a sip of leftover ale, or finger the ribbon under his pillow, before lying down again for the second sleep. and that second sleep was often lighter, filled with dreams. Some accounts suggest people were more likely to experience vivid visions in the later hours, perhaps because the body was already partly rested. A knight might wake at dawn remembering strange images, of battles, of saints, of animals speaking in human voices. Were these dreams omens, or just the brain weaving scraps of fear and longing into narrative? Medieval minds leaned toward meaning, so those second sleep visions carried weight. The rhythm of two-phase sleep also meant that the night felt longer, more segmented. Instead of one block of unconsciousness, it became two distinct chapters with an interlude. And that interlude gave space for small human acts, stoking a fire, whispering a prayer, or simply staring into the shadows. For a knight always trained to be vigilant, it also gave a chance to listen, to the wind outside, to the murmur of guards on the wall, to the life of the castle breathing around him. So while we picture medieval nights as endless stretches of cold and silence, in truth they had a pulse. First sleep, waking, second sleep, like the tolling of a bell through darkness, dividing the night into manageable pieces. And for a knight, caught between the rigours of duty and the frailty of the body, that rhythm was a small mercy, a structure within which he could rest, reflect, and rise again when dawn's chill bells finally called him forward. By now, you've drifted through first sleep, stirred in the waking hours, and slid back into second sleep. But those long stretches of night, broken only by firelight and faint candle glow, weren't simply quiet. They were haunted by imagination. The medieval world brimmed with superstitions, and midnight was their favourite stage. For a knight, lying under wool and fur, the cold wasn't always the scariest part. It was the fear that something unseen was prowling just beyond the curtain of shadows. Spirits were believed to wander most freely at night. The souls of the restless dead, denied peace by unfinished business, were thought to roam halls and courtyards. Knights, for all their training in sword and shield, couldn't parry against a ghostly figure whispering in the dark. Imagine lying awake in a chamber, the rushes rustling faintly, and convincing yourself it's not a rat but the spirit of a fallen comrade pacing the floor. Demons were another fear. The church taught that the devil and his servants lurked in darkness, ready to tempt, suffocate, or frighten the vulnerable sleeper. Nightmares, as we've said before, were sometimes explained as demons sitting on a person's chest. A knight might wake gasping, convinced that some infernal creature had been perched atop him, waiting to drag his soul. No amount of armour could help with that, only prayer, relics, or charms stitched into blankets. Here's a quirky fact. Iron was thought to ward off evil, which may explain why people sometimes kept knives or swords close at hand while sleeping. Not just for intruders, but for spirits. Imagine resting with your dagger at your side, its cold hilt comforting not only because it could kill a thief, but because you hoped its very metal would keep demons at bay. And then there were witches. Folklore whispered that witches prowled in the dead of night, seeking to steal milk from cows, sicken children, or even sap the strength of sleeping men. Knights, no less than peasants, were caught in these fears. A knight who woke weak or ill might whisper that a witch had ridden him in the night, a common phrase in medieval Europe, where being ridden meant visited and tormented in sleep. Imagine trying to steady your nerves, whispering a paternoster, hoping no shadow at the window is more than a trick of firelight. Historians debate how much these beliefs truly dominated nightly life. Some argue that knights, educated and steeped in theology, may have dismissed many of the wilder folk tales. Others counter that education didn't erase fear. If anything, it made people more vividly aware of the devil's supposed power. Even clerics wrote sermons warning of spirits that tempted men in their sleep. And we can't forget that knights were human, tired, cold, and vulnerable. They were just as susceptible to imagining a shadow moving when no one was there. Now close your eyes and place yourself in that chamber. You're lying on your side, the fire gone to ash, the candle gutted out. The room is almost black, except for a faint sliver of moonlight through the shutter crack. Suddenly you hear a soft creak. Your heart races. You grip the dagger by your bed, staring into the dark corner where the sound came from. Minutes pass. Nothing moves. It was probably just wood settling, or a rat in the rushes. Still, your grip on the dagger doesn't ease until exhaustion finally pulls you back into uneasy dreams. Superstition didn't only bring fear, it shaped rituals. Holy water sprinkled near the bed, charms sewn into clothes, prayers muttered aloud before the second sleep, all of these gave knights and their households a sense of control. Whether demons were real or not, the rituals were, and they gave a psychological armour just as important as steel. So while the knight's night was full of physical discomfort, cold, hunger, smoke, it was equally shaped by the unseen. To us, midnight is just darkness. To them, it was a living threshold where spirits prowled and demons whispered. And in that haunted stillness, a knight's greatest defence wasn't sword or shield, but faith. The night has stretched long, broken by horns, plagued by rats, softened by wine, unsettled by demons. And now, at last, the edge of dawn creeps toward the castle. But in a medieval fortress, morning didn't sneak in with soft alarm tones or sunlight slipping politely through glass windows. It came loudly, abruptly, and often before a knight was ready. Bells, shutters, servants bustling, animals stirring. These were the heralds of daybreak. For a knight curled under his furs, the arrival of morning was as cold and jarring as plunging into icy water. The first call usually came from bells. Castles attached to chapels rang the morning office, lords or prime, well before the sun fully rose. The sound of iron clanging against iron reverberated through stone, bouncing down corridors, echoing even into private chambers. Imagine being yanked from your second sleep by the harsh clang of a bell, your heart thumping, your dreams shattered. No gentle sunrise alarm clock, just an urgent metallic reminder that duty didn't wait for comfort. If it wasn't bells, it was shutters. Servants were tasked with opening wooden shutters to let in what little light the winter morning offered. Cold air rushed in with it, hitting your face before you were even fully awake. A knight could go from cocooned warmth to shivering in seconds, grumbling as his squire tugged back the bed curtains. Some households even believed the morning air was cleansing, sweeping out the stale night. For the knight, it simply meant another battle with the cold before he'd even risen. Here's a quirky fact. Roosters weren't just for farms, they were common in castle courtyards too. Their crowing layered over bells and horns, creating a morning chorus impossible to ignore. Imagine lying there, head pounding from too much spiced wine, only to hear the rooster crowing relentlessly below your window. Medieval mornings didn't do snooze buttons. Historians debate just how early the night's day really began. Some argue that nights rose with the first bells, tied to the church's rhythm of prayer and duty. Others suggest that unless there was a campaign, a hunt, or a feast, nights often lingered in bed longer, especially in winter when daylight was scarce. Evidence points both ways. Chronicles praising the diligence of lords who rose with dawn, but also satirical texts mocking lazy nobles who lingered under covers well past sunrise. The truth probably varied by household and personality. Now step into the moment yourself. The bell clangs in the chapel below. Your squire pulls back the bed curtains, and icy air slaps your face. You groan, roll over, clutch the blanket like a shield. But the fire has long gone out, and the cold stone walls wait for no one. The squire kneels by the armour, checking straps, already preparing for the day. You know you can't linger. The Lord expects you at morning council, or perhaps there's a hunt at first light. With a sigh, you push back the furs, plant your bare feet on the icy floor, and shiver as if struck by an arrow. The sounds of the castle grow louder. Servants scurry in the corridors, hauling water, clattering dishes. Dogs bark in the courtyard. Hooves clatter as horses are led out to be groomed. Somewhere children laugh, their voices thin and bright against the morning chill. The world outside your bed is awake, whether you want it to be or not. And yet, there's a strange satisfaction in it too. The night's battles, with cold, hunger, rats, and shadows, are over. The new day brings tasks you know, challenges you can meet with steel and skill. Whatever demons prowled your dreams are banished by the light. The morning bells may be harsh, but they're also a callback to purpose, to the order that defines the nightly life. So the knight rises, bleary-eyed, aching, chilled to the bone. He pulls on his linen, then wool, then armour, layer after layer until he is once more encased in the shell that makes him formidable. The warmth of bed is gone, but in its place comes resolve. Another day begins, and with it, another chance to endure. The bells have rung, the rooster has crowed, and the shutters have been thrown open to let in the icy morning. the knight has no excuse left. His night is over. Now comes the most dreaded moment of all, leaving the fragile cocoon of warmth and forcing his body back into the brutal embrace of armour and duty. Morning wasn't simply about rising. It was about prying yourself free from comfort and stepping willingly into discomfort all over again. First came the slow, painful separation from the bed. Imagine the knight clinging to his woolen blankets, knowing that once he lets go, the stone floor will bite like ice. Servants moved about briskly, bringing water in ewers, checking on clothes, laying out garments in the order they should be donned. The knight groaned, stretched, and finally pushed back the furs. His bare feet touched the rush-strewn floor, cold, uneven, sometimes damp. He shuddered, wishing for just a few more minutes of warmth, but the day's duties waited. The ritual of dressing was itself a struggle. First the linen shirt, stiff with last night's sweat, pulled over the head, then hose and chausses, woolen layers to cover the legs. A padded gambeson followed, quilted thickly to cushion the armour's bite. Already the warmth of bed felt like a distant memory. By the time the first straps of armour were being buckled, the knight's body was awake not from rest, but from sheer cold gnawing at every joint. Here's a quirky fact. Some knights kept their boots or chausses near the fire overnight, so they'd be easier to slip on in the morning. Without that trick, leather froze stiff in winter, making the first task of the day a wrestling match with your own footwear. Imagine trying to shove numb toes into icy boots, while your squire tugged and cursed under his breath. Not exactly the glamorous armour-donning scene depicted in illuminated manuscripts. And then came the sword. Always nearby through the night, it now returned to the belt, the familiar weight tugging at the hip. For a knight, fastening the sword wasn't just gearing up, it was reclaiming his identity. The knight had stripped him down to a vulnerable human, shivering like anyone else. The sword reminded him of his role, defender, warrior, servant of his lord. It was both a tool and a statement. The day had begun, and he was ready to meet it. Historians argue whether knights always donned full armour at dawn. On campaign, yes. It was wise to be prepared. In castles, however, armour might be worn only for patrols, drills, or ceremonies. Some mornings the knight rose simply into civilian tunics and cloaks, saving the heavy plates for when needed. Still, the symbolic act of strapping on at least a sword or dagger was universal. Even in the most peaceful households, danger felt too close to leave steel far from reach. Now imagine yourself as the knight in that moment. The furs have fallen away, the chamber's draught gnaws at your skin, and your squire is already cinching straps on your gambeson. You glance at the bed, still warm, still inviting, but you know it will remain empty until another long, cold night. The armour clinks softly as piece by piece it returns to your body, each buckle sealing you into the persona the world expects. By the time the final strap is pulled tight, the knight in bed is gone. In his place stands the knight of day, ready to train, to serve, or to march. The castle itself comes alive as he steps out of the chamber. Bells echo in the courtyard, dogs bark, smoke curls upward from kitchens where bread and porridge are already being prepared. The stables are busy, the chapel is full of murmured prayers, and servants rush past carrying buckets of water or armloads of firewood. The night's silence has shattered into the noise of a life, and yet for all the bustle a trace of the night lingers. The stiffness in the night's joints, the faint echo of dreams, the memory of cold stone underfoot, they follow him into the day. He may stand tall in armour, but inside he still feels the fragility of the human who only hours ago curled under blankets, muttering prayers against draughts and demons. That was the paradox of a knight's life. By day he was steel and duty, by night flesh and fear. Rising each morning meant pulling both halves back together, the vulnerable man and the armoured warrior. And as he marched into the day, the memory of the coldest nights never left him. It was part of his endurance, part of his training, part of the strange rhythm of life inside a medieval castle. And here we are at the end of the journey. You've walked the halls of a freezing fortress, curled beneath scratchy wool, shared warmth with fellow sleepers, prayed away shadows, and endured horns, hunger, and the faint skitter of rats. You've woken at midnight, whispered to saints, and clutched a ribbon or a dagger to fend off fears. You've dragged yourself out of bed at dawn, stiff and reluctant, ready to slip back into steel. All of it, every flickering candle, every smoky fire, every cold breath, painted the reality of how nights truly lived through the darkest, frost-bitten nights. But now, thankfully, you're not lying on straw in a drafty hall. You're not shivering under damp fur or listening for demons scratching at the shutters. You're here, in your own time, with comforts those nights couldn't have dreamed of. Soft bedding, clean air, heating, maybe even the hum of a fan or a quiet glow of a screen. Compared to the struggle of those long winter nights, you're practically in paradise. So take a deep breath. Let the weight of their world settle in your imagination, and then let it drift away. The nights endured what they had to: smoke, hunger, superstition, endless interruptions. But you don't have to. Tonight you can pull the covers around you, find your own comfortable position, and let your body finally relax without fear of horns or drafts. You don't need a brazier smouldering dangerously by your bed, or a squire to stoke your fire. You just need to close your eyes and know you're safe, warm, and free of all that stonewall discomfort. So with that, let's leave the medieval night behind. Let the echoes of bells and the whispers of prayers fade into quiet. You've journeyed through the coldest of castle nights, and now it's time for your own rest. Sleep deep, dream gently, and may your night be warmer and softer than any night ever knew.